LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for being here this morning. I'm going to start with a conversation really that resets our thinking on megapolis and nation building projects. Because by their nature, nation building projects are very long. They take a number of years to eventuate. And if we don't start with the end in mind, what it is that we're trying to achieve for the country, then we risk creating a lot of work, spending a lot of money, but at the end of it, not realizing our goals. And so I'm going to start with this quote by William Gibson that says, "The future is already here and it's not evenly distributed." And I believe that to be the case. And for those of us that have traveled, you'll accept that there is definitely a whole world out there that looks and feels very different to what we experience every day. And I'm basing this conversation on some work by Klaus Schwab, the chairman of the World Economic Forum, where he coined the term the fourth industrial revolution. And I think it's important for us to understand the impact of the previous three before I talk about the fourth, and really set the scene for how I think technology might have an impact on our society in a profound way, and in a way that we can plan for now and build into our infrastructure projects and our nation building projects. And so if you think about the first industrial revolution, steam power had been around for thousands of years actually, but the first commercial steam boiler was in the 1760s, where a company was producing them as water pumps. But then in 1805, the first steam engine, the first locomotive was created. And it transformed society. It was the first time that a machine could move people and goods faster than a horse. And it also opened new frontiers and really changed the nature of transportation, but also business and frontiers around the globe. So that the core technology in that was steam power, but it was the commercialization of the steam locomotive that really changed the world. The second industrial revolution was the advent or the creation of the electricity utility. Reliable, standardized power being distributed by a utility that leveraged scale to create opportunity. And if you look at this intersection in New York in the Flatiron District in 1905, all you'll see here is streetcars and horses. And at that time, 25% of all of the food grown, all the agriculture crops grown in the US was fed to horses. And then if you fast forward 20 years, there are no horses left. And so that second industrial revolution, the advent of electricity, allowed commercial production of motor vehicles. It allowed electric-powered streetcars to really transform transportation in our society, but so many other things came as a result of that. Division of labour, mass factories, those sorts of things. And so these industrial revolutions are usually underpinned by a piece of technology that may have been around for a while, but becomes commercially viable and commercially adopted at scale, that really transforms society in ways that were unanticipated. The third industrial revolution was really the advent or the creation of commercial information technology, and it was really about white-collar work being changed. And in the 1960s, the US Census Department had a role known as a computer. You could have a job title, that on your business card. But what was profound that is in only 10 years, all of those roles, and there were thousands of them that basically tabulated the census and did demographic research based on that, were replaced by a small number of mainframe computers. And of course, you know, we've seen that transform white-collar work and really change the way all of us work today. And this presentation and this session being streamed on the internet is a great example of that. The underlying technology that was the microprocessor. And the microprocessor is made of silicon, the most plentiful resource on the planet, but also now one of the most expensive resources once it's converted into a silicon chip. So the fourth industrial revolution is the belief of this convergent set of forces, physical, biological, and digital technologies that are coming together. And an example of that in the physical world would be autonomous vehicles, robotics, and 3D printing. And again, those things have been around for quite some time. But I can now go to a computer retailer and I can buy a 3D printer that costs maybe $1,000. And with that $1,000 device, I can print a part for my washing machine when it fails. And so think of the disintermediation of so many channels, so many things that we take for granted today. Warehousing, delivery trucks, materials management, manufacturing, where you can move it to the consumer. That's one example of these convergent forces. And the others are things like genetic diagnosis and genetic treatment, being able to treat an individual sick person's genome versus giving them a treatment for the disease or the condition they're suffering. And then the third thing is things like blockchain and Internet of Things. And blockchain is a distributed ledger that has the potential to interrupt banking as we know it. And there's a whole lot of research going into financial technologies, or fintech as they're known, that will continue to transform one of the world's oldest industries. And the underlying technology in all of these, what's making them commercially viable and scalable today, is the cloud. And the cloud is an abstract term for most of us, but it really means these things: data centers. Data centers at a scale like utilities were created today for electricity. Most of us don't have a generator and an electrician on staff for our home, but in 1905, you probably would have. Today, we buy our electricity from a utility, and tomorrow we believe most organisations will buy their computing power from a hyperscale cloud. Now, the challenge for us as a society is there's not going to be hundreds of people that do this. There's only going to be a small number of companies that have the capital and the resources to be able to drive this kind of scale to make it effective. So the question for us is, how do we both take advantage of that, and how do we make sure we manage the risk? And I'll talk about that in the second half of this presentation. To set the stage a little bit, there's a technology that's getting a lot of buzz at the moment called machine learning. And again, this has been around for a long time. You'll know it as things like deep learning, artificial intelligence. If you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, you would have seen HAL, this sentient computer that tried to take over the world and went rogue. And that's a definite risk. We are at a point where we are approaching the singularity, the ability of a machine to mimic and replicate the human brain. And it's not going to be long until the potential of a machine to learn and make decisions will exceed that of a human being. And so when we think about digital transformation, whether it's societies, governments, or organisations, I find it's helpful to break it down into sort of 4 categories that most business leaders can understand in a simple way that you can have a board conversation. And those are: think about how you engage your customers or citizens differently. How do you empower your employees to make better decisions faster and more empowered while managing control and governance? The third part is, how do you optimize operations? And this is where a lot of time is spent today with technology. It's better, cheaper, faster with technology. And there is a point where that's valuable, and every organization needs to do that, but it can be a zero-sum game if the access to the underlying technology is available to your competitors as well. And then the last thing is transform products and services. And we're starting to see that around the world with innovation happening in all sorts of places, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. So I think as leaders, if you're here today at this summit, you come here because you're passionate about how do we drive these projects to success? How do we make the country more prosperous? And we need to understand, boards need to understand, governments need to understand, how do we leverage these technologies in a way that's good for our society, understanding that other people will also do that and we can't afford to be left behind. And so think about companies like Tesla. And we think of this as kind of version 1 of autonomous vehicles. It's a vehicle that has dozens, if not hundreds of sensors that can drive the vehicle without you needing to steer, brake, accelerate, etc. Now, it's not perfect. There have been 2 fatalities already, but the stats point out that this version 1 vehicle is already safer than a human in terms of miles and hours driven. This example in Germany talks about a utility that took what was a cost centre for them in terms of streetlights and made it into a profit centre. So they've put wireless charging stations, they've put sensors on the streetlights and are able to generate new revenue streams. So it's an example of transforming your products and services. But we need to think about how our markets will change, particularly in jobs. If you take my example of the second industrial revolution and the impact that had. And so think about driverless vehicles in commercial. So if you look at, in Singapore at the moment, they're running a trial where there's a company called Nutonomy that is running driverless taxis. You can call a taxi on an app, a vehicle turns up without someone in it, and it can drive you around in Singapore to specific neighbourhoods without anyone driving the vehicle. That's real today commercial deployment. Think about Amazon and a number of other companies thinking about drone delivery. How do we use this technology to transform the way we manage congestion, the way we manage service delivery with drones delivering packages? And then this is Nadine. She's a She's the receptionist for Nanyang Technology University in Singapore. It's probably not obvious, but she's actually an android robot. She has cameras in her eyes, she has microphones in her ears, she learns and understands who you are, and she will remember conversations, and she adapts to your emotional responses. This is a prototype, but it's a reality that we're going to see robotic receptionists that are probably more effective than the ones we have today. And so I want to end to stimulate this conversation with, we always overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year, and we always underestimate what we can achieve in 10. So I look forward to the conversation, and thank you.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.